The rope has cut into his palms again, and he does not slow the drawing of it. Somewhere in Athens, a citizen sleeps in a bed he can afford. Here, in the small hours, the former boxer leans over the well and lifts water for a woman who pays him in coins so small he counts them by feel. In the morning, he will walk to the Stoa and sit at the feet of Zeno, and Zeno will ask him, as Zeno has asked before, where his money comes from, and Cleanthes will say nothing. He says nothing because the answer would embarrass no one but himself, and because a man who studies philosophy ought not to require pity to continue. There is a story, preserved by Diogenes Laertius, that certain Athenians, suspicious of how a man so poor could afford the leisure to study, brought Cleanthes before the court on the charge that he must be earning his bread by some means unworthy of a free citizen. He produced 2 witnesses, the gardener in whose plot he drew water, and the woman whose flour he ground by night. The court, we are told, offered him 10 minae in admiration. Zeno forbade him to accept it. We begin here, at the well, in the dark, because everything that Cleanthes would later become, everything he would write, every hymn he would compose, every school he would inherit, was built upon this rope and this bucket, and upon a word the Greeks used for what he was doing: Karteria, endurance. Not the endurance of the battlefield, which lasts an afternoon, but the endurance of the ordinary night, which lasts a life. The principle we will consider in this episode is Karteria, and one must be careful with the translation. The English word endurance carries a certain grim flavor, as though what is endured is always suffering, and as though the enduring itself is a kind of clenched refusal. The Greek word is broader and quieter. Karteria is the strength that persists. It is the disposition of a soul that continues at its work when the work is difficult, when the work is thankless, when the work is invisible, and when there is no one present to observe whether it continues or not. It is related in the Stoic vocabulary to karteros, meaning strong or steadfast, and it names not an act but a settled quality of character. For the Stoics, Karteria was not one virtue among many, but the ground upon which the practice of philosophy itself rested. Zeno had taught that virtue was the sole good, and that virtue expressed itself in 4 cardinal forms: wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. Endurance sits beneath courage as one of its species, but it is broader than the courage of battle. Courage confronts fear. Endurance confronts time. And the philosopher, Zeno believed, had need of endurance above all, because philosophy was not a matter of grasping a doctrine and then possessing it. Philosophy was a matter of returning to the same doctrine every day, of practicing the same exercises, of correcting the same errors, of losing the same ground and regaining it, of waking each morning to the discovery that yesterday's clarity has become today's fog. Cleanthes himself, in a fragment preserved to us, is said to have compared philosophical work to writing on wax tablets. The letters must be pressed in slowly, and if the wax is cold, the stylus finds no purchase, and if the wax is too warm, the letters do not hold. One must return, one must press again, one must be patient with the material. The material, in the case of philosophy, is oneself. Zeno, we are told, said of his student that Cleanthes was like a hard tablet, difficult to write upon, but once written upon, the letters remained. This is the character of endurance. It is not quickness. It is not brilliance. It is the capacity of the soul to receive an impression slowly, and to hold that impression against the erasures of time. Let us reflect on what this means before we turn to the man himself. In our reading of the Stoics, we sometimes imagine that the philosophical life is a matter of insight, of the sudden recognition of a truth that then reorders everything. We imagine Marcus writing his meditations in a single luminous evening. We imagine Epictetus speaking with the finality of one who has already arrived. But the Stoics themselves did not describe their work in this way. They described it as ascesis, as practice, as the daily repetition of exercises whose value became apparent only over years. And beneath ascesis lay Karteria, the willingness to continue the practice when the practice yielded nothing visible, when the soul remained stubborn, when the same passion rose again in the same circumstance for the 100th time. Cleanthes, more than any of the early Stoics, embodied this understanding. He was not a man of sudden brilliance. His writings, of which fragments survive, are marked by patience rather than flash, and his life, from what the ancient biographers preserve for us, was a long demonstration that philosophy belongs to those who can endure the doing of it. Let us turn now to the man. Cleanthes of Assos was born, by the reckoning of the ancient sources, around the year 331 before the Common Era, in a small city on the coast of Asia Minor, in what is now the western edge of Turkey. His father's name was Fannius, and the family appears to have been of modest means, but not destitute. In his youth, Cleanthes was a boxer. This detail, though often mentioned in passing, matters. He was not a scholar by native temperament. He was a large man, physically strong, accustomed to standing in a ring and receiving blows. When he came to Athens, according to Diogenes Laertius, he arrived with 4 drachmas in his possession. 4 drachmas would have fed him for perhaps a week. He was, by the standards of the city he entered, nothing. Athens in the late 4th century before the Common Era was no longer the city of Pericles, but it remained the intellectual capital of the Greek world. Alexander was dead a generation. His successors, the Diadochi, had carved his empire into kingdoms, and Athens had settled into a diminished but still vital existence, its harbour busy, its assembly still meeting, its philosophical schools flourishing. The Academy of Plato continued under his successors. The Lyceum of Aristotle continued under Theophrastus. The Garden of Epicurus had recently been founded, and in the painted colonnade at the northwest corner of the Agora, the Stoa Poikile, from which the Stoic school would take its name, an immigrant from Citium named Zeno was gathering students. Cleanthes attached himself first, we are told, to the Cynic crates, and then to Zeno, and he remained with Zeno for 19 years. 19 years. Consider this figure carefully. It is not the length of an apprenticeship. It is the length of a marriage, of a working career, of a slow and thorough transformation. For 19 years, Cleanthes attended the lectures of a man his own age, or nearly so, and did the work of a student, and did not attempt to found his own school, or write his own doctrine, or distinguish himself from his teacher. He supported himself all through these years by manual labor performed at night. The story of the well is not a legend. Multiple ancient sources confirm it. He drew water in a garden owned by a man whose name is not preserved, and he ground flour for a woman whose name is likewise lost, and he did this by night, so that his days were free for philosophy. He was called by other Athenians who knew of his labor the Phreantals, the well-drawer. The Athenians, one gathers, did not intend this as a compliment. To draw water was the work of slaves and of women. A free man who did such work in exchange for wages was doing something anomalous, something almost improper. The nickname carried a sting, but Cleanthes accepted it. When asked why he continued at such labor, when his philosophical reputation might have earned him easier work, he is said to have replied that he did not wish to be beholden to anyone, and that a philosopher who could not support himself was not yet a philosopher. His physical condition bore the marks of this life. Diogenes tells us that his skin was rough and his hands calloused, and that when a certain man in the gymnasium mocked him for his appearance, Zeno defended him, saying that the marks on his body were the marks of his labor, and that they honored him. In another account, when an Athenian remarked upon the poor state of Cleanthes' cloak, Cleanthes replied that he wore the cloak he could afford, and that the cloak was warm enough. He was not, it seems, a man given to complaint, nor was he given to display. The ancient sources describe him as slow of speech, as careful, as reluctant to venture opinions until he had considered them thoroughly. Zeno, who was quick and sharp and famously ironic, sometimes grew impatient with his students' deliberateness. But Zeno also, we are told, valued him above the more brilliant students, because what Cleanthes learned, he kept. The other students, Zeno said, would write upon their souls with soft styluses, and the writing would fade. Cleanthes wrote with a hard stylus upon hard wax, and the writing remained. When Zeno died, around the year 262 before the Common Era, the leadership of the school passed to Cleanthes. This was not universally welcomed. There were more famous students, more accomplished rhetoricians, more visible personalities within the Stoic circle. Ariston of Chios, in particular, had a following and a public presence that Cleanthes lacked, but Zeno, in his final years, had made clear his preference. The school he wished should be led by the man who had endured longest at its practice, not by the man who had shone most brightly at its debates. Cleanthes led the school for approximately 32 years. He was, by the time he assumed its leadership, already old, perhaps 69, and he continued as scholar until his death at the age of 99, or in some accounts, 101. He did not marry. He did not accumulate property. He continued in his old age to live simply, and though he no longer drew water by night, the habits of that labor stayed with him. During his scholarcate, the Stoic school grew and consolidated. Cleanthes was not, by all accounts, a systematizer in the manner of his eventual successor Chrysippus, who would rework Stoic doctrine into the formidable technical apparatus by which the school is now largely known. Cleanthes' contribution was different. He preserved what Zeno had taught, added to it in the realms of theology and physics, and above all, embodied in his own person the Stoic claim that philosophy was a way of life and not merely a body of arguments. We turn now to how the principle of endurance actually functioned in his existence, and here we must attend to the particulars. The 19 years of study first. Consider what it means to sit as a student for 19 years. In our own time, we are accustomed to the idea that education is a phase, that one graduates from it into some fuller condition, and that continued study past a certain age represents either specialization or delay. The Stoics did not conceive of philosophy in this way. Philosophy was not a phase, it was the whole of the life. Cleanthes, in remaining 19 years at Zeno's side, was not delaying. He was practicing, and the practice was demanding. The Stoic curriculum, as Zeno taught it, comprised 3 parts: logic, physics, and ethics. Logic included not only formal reasoning, but the whole theory of how the mind receives and evaluates impressions. Physics included the theory of nature, of the divine reason permeating the cosmos, of the material composition of all things. Ethics included the doctrine of virtue, of the passions, of the appropriate acts, and of the goal of life. A student was expected to become competent in all 3. He was expected to memorize substantial passages, to master arguments, to defend positions in dialectical exchange, and he was expected to do all of this while conducting the exercises of self-examination and self-correction that the Stoics considered essential. Cleanthes did this work while sleeping little, eating simply, and laboring for wages at night. The ancient sources emphasize that he was not physically diminished by this regime. On the contrary, his endurance became proverbial. When one of the other students, seeing him at his labors, expressed sympathy, Cleanthes is said to have replied that the labor freed his mind, that the drawing of water gave him time to consider what he had heard in the day's lecture, and that many of his best thoughts came at the well, the hymn to Zeus. This is the longest work of Cleanthes that survives, though only in fragmentary form, and it deserves attention. It is a philosophical poem of 39 lines, addressed to the supreme God as the Stoics conceived him, the rational principle of the cosmos. The poem does not exhort, it does not moralize, it observes. It describes the order of nature, the permeation of the divine reason through all things, and the position of the human soul within that order. And it contains a line that has been translated many ways, and that I will render here in the older English of the 19th century translators. Lead me, O Zeus, and thou, O destiny, wherever your decrees have appointed me. I follow readily, but if I choose not, wretched though I be, I must follow still. Consider this line. It is not defiance, it is not resignation. It is the observation of a man who has learned, over many years of drawing water in the dark, that his willingness or unwillingness does not alter the necessity of the labor. What alters is only whether he draws with a settled soul or with a resistant one. The rope cuts the palms of the willing man and the palms of the unwilling man alike. But the willing man does not add to the pain of the rope the further pain of resenting the rope. This is Karteria stated with the maximum economy. Endurance is not the acceptance of suffering. It is the refusal to compound suffering by resisting what one cannot alter. Cleanthes learned this, we may suppose, at the well, and he preserved it in a hymn that Epictetus, 3 centuries later, would quote as though it were a personal creed, the response to public mockery. The ancient sources preserve several anecdotes on this subject. Cleanthes was not, in Athens, a respected figure during most of his student years. He was known as the water drawer. He was mocked for his poverty, for his slow speech, for his lack of polish. The philosopher Arcesilaus, head of the academy and a rival to the Stoic school, once remarked in Cleanthes' presence that he seemed a rather dull fellow. Cleanthes replied, according to Diogenes, that this was true, and that he was fortunate to be so because his dullness protected him from the temptations that quicker minds encountered. This is not a witty comeback. It is a slow answer. It is the answer of a man who has considered over years what his limitations are and what his limitations are for. He does not defend himself. He does not counter-mock. He accepts the assessment and locates within it the ground of his own practice. The Scholarcate. When Cleanthes inherited the school, he did not attempt to become what he was not. He did not seek to compete with the more brilliant rhetoricians. He did not try to expand the school's public profile or increase its enrollment through spectacle. He continued as he had begun, teaching what Zeno had taught, adding where he thought addition was warranted, and preserving above all the practical character of the school. The Stoa under Cleanthes was not a place of dazzling debate. It was a place of steady work. Ariston of Chios, who had wished to lead the school, broke away and founded his own faction, teaching a more austere version of Stoic ethics that eventually failed to survive. Cleanthes did not respond to this schism with public argument. He simply continued at his teaching. The school continued. Ariston's faction did not. The endurance of the one who remains at his post outlasts the flash of the one who departs to found his own. His death, finally. Diogenes preserves a striking account. Cleanthes in old age developed an inflammation of the gums, and his physicians advised him to fast for 2 days. After the 2 days he had improved, but he elected to continue the fast, saying that since he had come so far along the road, he might as well complete the journey. He died of self-imposed starvation at an advanced age, calmly and without complaint. One may consider this a strange end, and one need not endorse it. The Stoics permitted, in certain circumstances, the philosophical suicide, the reasoned departure from life when life had reached its natural conclusion. Whether Cleanthes' choice was wise, whether it exceeded what the doctrine authorized, is a question one may debate. But what is not in question is the manner of the choice. He met his death as he had met his labor, with the same settled composure, the same refusal to complain, the same acceptance of what the situation required. Let us now consider what Cleanthes is teaching us, plainly. The first lesson is that philosophy is labor. This is easily said and difficultly grasped. When we read the ancient philosophers, we read the finished product, the polished argument, the crystallized insight. We do not see the years of daily practice that produce these things. We do not see the mornings when the practice yielded nothing, the arguments that failed, the passions that rose again, despite the exercises meant to quiet them. Cleanthes is teaching us that the finished product is not the philosophy. The labor is the philosophy. The water drawn night after night, the tablet written upon and rewritten, the same passage of Zeno's teaching returned to for the 7th or 70th time. If we take this seriously, we cannot approach Stoicism as we might approach a subject to be mastered. There is no mastery. There is only continuation. The Stoic who has practiced for 40 years is not further along the same road as the beginner. He is on the same road, at the same place, doing the same work, and his advantage is only that he has done the work for longer and knows more precisely what the work consists in. The second lesson concerns the invisibility of the work. Cleanthes drew water at night. No one saw him. No one applauded. The wages were small. The labor was unremarked. But the philosophical work he did during those years, the receiving of Zeno's teaching, the pressing of it into the hard wax of his soul, was likewise invisible. No one could see it happening. No one, perhaps not even Zeno, could have said, at any given moment during those 19 years, how much progress Cleanthes had made. This is the condition of philosophical work generally. It happens in the dark. It happens without witnesses. It happens without immediate results, and it must be continued anyway. The philosopher who requires visible progress, who requires that his labor be recognized, who requires that his growth be observable at the end of each week or each year, will not continue long enough for the labor to bear fruit. Endurance requires the willingness to work without the reassurance of visible reward. The third lesson concerns endurance and identity. Cleanthes was called the well-drawer, and he accepted the name. He did not attempt to be something other than what his circumstances made him. He did not, upon becoming known as a philosopher, distance himself from the labor that had sustained him. When he became scholarch, he did not adopt the manner of a scholarch as it might have been performed by another. He continued to be Cleanthes, slow of speech, careful of judgment, patient with the material of his own soul. Endurance, in Cleanthes' example, is not a matter of clinging to one's dignity in the face of hardship. It is a matter of accepting that the hardship is one's dignity, that the labor is one's philosophy, that there is no separation between the visible circumstance and the inward practice. The man at the well is the philosopher. There are not two people, one who draws water for wages and another who studies under Zeno. There is one person, and his study is his drawing, and his drawing is his study. The fourth and final lesson is the one most easily lost. Endurance is not grim. It is not a matter of clenched teeth. Cleanthes, from what the ancient sources preserve, was not a bitter man. He was slow, patient, careful, but he was not grim. He composed a hymn to the ordering reason of the cosmos and asked to be led wherever destiny appointed. He accepted the mockery of the Athenians and turned it aside without resentment. He continued at his labor for decades and did not, so far as we know, complain that the labor was hard. Karteria, properly practiced, is not the endurance of a soul that resents its condition. It is the endurance of a soul that has ceased to resent, that has accepted the shape of its own life, and that finds within the shape the room to do its proper work. The one who endures grimly has not yet endured. He has only postponed the collapse. The one who endures well is the one who has understood that the labor and the philosopher are not two things, and that the drawing of the water is not the obstacle to the study, but the study itself, conducted in another form. We have reached the end of our consideration. The story of Cleanthes has come down to us through many hands, and it is likely that the details have been polished by admiring biographers. Perhaps the nights at the well were fewer than the sources suggest. Perhaps the 4 drachmas he arrived with in Athens were somewhat more. These questions we cannot settle, but the shape of the story is preserved with unusual consistency across the ancient sources, and the shape is what matters. A man of no particular brilliance came to Athens with nothing, attached himself to a teacher, labored at menial work by night for 19 years to support his study, and by continuing longer than others could continue, became the second scholarch of a school that would outlast Athens itself and shape the interior life of an emperor 3 centuries later. The Stoics believed that most things worth having are the fruit of practice, and that practice is the fruit of endurance. They did not promise that the practice would be pleasant, or that the endurance would be recognized, or that the years of quiet labor would issue in fame or comfort. They promised only that the labor was its own reward, because the labor was the shape of the philosophical life. and the philosophical life was the only life worth the living of it. Here is the question you may carry with you from this episode. Consider what work in your own life resembles the drawing of water in the dark. Consider what you continue at, or have continued at, without applause and without visible reward, and whether you continue at it with resentment or with the settled composure that Cleanthes brought to his rope and his bucket. Consider whether there is, somewhere in the shape of your ordinary days, a labor that is not the obstacle to your inward life, but is, in fact, its practice. The Stoics would tell you that this question is not to be answered quickly. It is to be sat with, returned to, considered at intervals over many mornings, as Cleanthes considered what he had heard at Zeno's lecture while he drew water in the small hours. The answer, when it comes, will come slowly, pressed into the hard wax of a patient soul. It will not fade.